In the previous lesson, we took an introduction to the judiciary for AQA A-level politics. This lesson is going to start talking about some of the subsidiary issues relating to the judiciary, one of which being this idea of judicial independence and the ways in which neutrality and independence is maintained and is supported through various different policies within the UK judiciary itself. So, when we think about judicial independence, we can compare and contrast this, especially when we do comparative politics, to the ways that the judiciary in the United States is actually not particularly very independent. There's quite a lot of political processes that exists throughout the appointment of judges or justices, shall I say, to the Supreme Court and to other circuit level judges in the United States. Because of course it is the Senate that ratifies and the Senate that essentially signs off on appointments that are made by the president, which is obviously two very highly political institutions that are making decisions on the basis of the judiciary. When we talk about the United Kingdom, however, at all levels of the judiciary, there is the expectation of operating with a high level of independence from politics. Now, this is to essentially maintain the view that courts should be apolitical, that they should not be making decisions on the basis of political decisions, on the basis of political ideas and decisions. Rather, they should be strictly adhering to the strict application of the law. They don't get involved in matters of politics, but only matters of law. Even where the matters of law are of paramount political importance, like, for example, the prorogation cases that existed with the two Miller cases, the Miller 1 and Miller 2, these were, or at least the prorogation case is Miller 2, but the Parliament's consent to activate Article 50 was Miller 1. These are, while political in the sense that they are involving political ideas and that they are very, very important to politics, the actual judgments and the rulings themselves concern matters of law. So we will speak about the prorogation case and the other Miller case as well at sort of various points throughout these various lessons. Essentially, the first Miller case concerned whether or not Article 50, which is of course the provision within the Treaty on European Union to start the process of leaving the European Union from member state. You trigger Article 50, then there's a 2-year period where you negotiate a deal. If there's no deal negotiated, you can either push for an extension or you can go and leave the European Union without a trade deal. Now, it was argued in the first Miller case, on the one hand, that in order for Article 50 to actually be implemented, for Article 50 to actually be triggered, there needed to be consent from Parliament. There needed to be a vote in Parliament. Whereas, on the other hand, there was the view that only the government needed to do so, and so it could be unilaterally done by the Prime Minister or the Minister for Secretary of State for exiting the European Union. Ultimately, the Supreme Court sided with the former argument that Parliament would require an act of Parliament or a vote in Parliament in order for the Article 50 to be triggered. This, of course, concerned the view that only Parliament can change the law, and the judges represented this as suggesting that triggering Article 50 would represent a change to the law, and so therefore it had to do with Parliament. The second Miller case concerned the prorogation of Parliament. Essentially, and simply put, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister at the time, wanted to prorogue Parliament for longer than expected. Normally, the prorogation of Parliament takes place in the weeks leading up to the Queen's speech, now the King's speech, but what Boris Johnson wanted to do effectively was to prorogue Parliament for 6 weeks, which is significantly longer than any other prorogation in history, for the purposes of stifling any kind of parliamentary deliberation on the matter of Brexit, his Brexit deal. The Supreme Court ruled that this was unlawful. So those are the prorogation case and the Miller case. So the two Miller cases, should I say, prorogation case and the Article 50 case. These are important for our understanding of how the judiciary upholds the law, as well as acts in contravention to the government and attacks the government in that way. It is important when we think about judicial independence to draw a distinction between this idea of independence on the one hand and neutrality on the other. So when we think about independence, we mean that they are not subjected to external control. They are independent from external control. This makes sense. They are not essentially at the wills or the behests of any other institution or individual. If they are subject to external control, this could compromise their neutrality, but neutrality concerns their decisions. It concerns their involvement in particular matters. So, for example, if the judiciary was heavily funded by the government, then cases involving the government cannot said to be neutral, since the judiciary would have a vested interest in the government winning a case. It means that they are not independent because they are funded by the government, directly funded by the government, and so therefore they cannot be neutral in decisions because they will have a vested interest in the government winning a case. This is why when we talk about independence and neutrality, strict rules are in place to ensure that both are adhered to, that the judiciary is independent, and so as a result of that, what exists as a result of independence is downstream from that, the idea of neutrality. So how do we maintain judicial independence in the UK? Well, the first is the security of tenure. Every single judge is appointed for an open-ended term, and they are only limited by retirement, that they must retire, or if they retire either voluntarily or at the age of 75. This means that there cannot be threats to their job on the basis of decisions that they have made. The government can't come in and say, you rule in favour of us or we will threaten your job. They have security of tenure. There is no power outside of the judiciary that would allow for them to essentially be sacked from their job, to be fired from their job. They also have guaranteed salaries. This is done from the Consolidated Fund. Now, the Consolidated Fund essentially is a government bank account which is used to pay the salaries of judges and other independent officials. Now, the Consolidated Fund is actually managed and ran by the Bank of England. The Bank of England is independent. It is no longer subject to government control and hasn't been subject to government control since Gordon Brown became Chancellor in 1997. In fact, that was one of the first things that the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1997 actually did, was make the Bank of England independent. There is also rules, very strict rules in fact, in adherence to the idea of the contempt of court. Ministers are prevented from speaking on trials because they can be charged with contempt of court. In fact, quite a lot of people can be charged with contempt of court. Anybody could theoretically be charged with contempt of court in discussing and examining cases and decisions before they are actually made for fear of or fear of accidentally or inadvertently biasing an outcome. There is also the separation of powers. Prior to the Constitutional Reform Act, we note that the Lord Chancellor sat on all three branches of government, which of course was a complete contravention and really slapped in the face of this idea of the separation of powers. But since 2005, since the Constitutional Reform Act, the Chancellor no longer sits on all three branches, and the Supreme Court opens in 2009, which formally separated the Supreme Court from Parliament itself. Now, this isn't to suggest that the Supreme Court, when it was in the House of Lords, i.e. when they were the law lords, that this meant that they were not independent then, but essentially what it does is just clearly show that there is two distinct institutions, putting some clear blue water between the people who make the law, Parliament themselves, and the people who adjudicate and interpret and apply the law, the Supreme Court. When it comes to the appointment of judges to the senior judiciary, there is an independent appointment process. This was established again by the Constitutional Reform Act in 2005, and it created the Judicial Appointments Committee. This is the JAC. We'll talk about the JAC in the next lesson, but fundamentally the JAC is an independent process by which not only judges their appointments are transparent on the one hand, but also the fact that they are independent on the other. They're not influenced by political coercion.